Hello, Fright Family. How are you doing today? I hope you're cozy, because tonight we're diving into some true scary stories straight from Quora. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where and when are you watching this? Are you wrapped up in bed, listening to the rain, or perhaps watching during a late-night shift? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories and thoughts make this community so special. And if you enjoy the spine-tingling tales we share, don't forget to hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. It really helps us grow. For even more exclusive content and bonus stories, join our Patreon family. Links are in the description. Your support means the world and keeps the chills coming. Now, turn the lights low, let the rain carry you away, and let's get into tonight's tales. I have a story to share, one that most people find unsettling when they hear it. It doesn't faze me much personally, but I've noticed how others react. A visible shiver, a grimace, even a soft gasp. What's interesting is that I didn't experience it firsthand. It was told to me later. Whether it's true or not, I can't say for sure, but I find it fascinating either way. Before diving into the main part, some context is necessary. When I was just shy of 2 years old, my mother became gravely ill. She went to see a doctor and was given a devastating diagnosis. She had an aggressive illness that didn't offer much hope. While the exact details of her condition escape me, I know the prognosis was bleak. Despite that, the doctor encouraged her to try treatment. After all, there were those who had survived worse odds. My mother, however, was living a life that could only be described as a daily battle. At 42 years old, she was struggling to end a turbulent marriage to my father, a man who was unreliable at best and destructive at worst. He had drained her finances, disappeared for days on end, and, on one occasion, had even taken me from her, demanding money for my return. It was a chaotic, exhausting life. She was raising 7 children in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment while holding down 3 jobs, flipping burgers at fast food joints and cleaning rooms at a small hotel. Her eldest daughter, only 16, had recently become a mother herself and was grappling with raising her own child. Her second oldest daughter, 14, was rebellious and distant, unwilling to shoulder any responsibility. That left her eldest son, just 11 years old, to look after his younger brother and me, the baby. He sacrificed his childhood, giving up carefree afternoons with his Sega Genesis, to step into a role no child should have to fill. The pressure was relentless. My mother had no health insurance, no savings, and no lifeline. What little money she earned was already stretched thin, assigned to food, rent, and basic survival. When she received her diagnosis, I can't imagine what thoughts must have raced through her mind. The choice she made, though, was one of acceptance. She decided not to pursue treatment. It wasn't a decision made lightly, I'm sure. Fighting through grueling, weakening therapies might seem like the natural course, but surrendering, to come to terms with the inevitable, is its own form of bravery. She focused instead on preparing her children for life without her. Over the next few months, she arranged for her children to have new homes. The 2 eldest daughters moved out. Her teenage daughter moved in with her partner and his family. The next youngest daughter went to live with a cousin. Her 2 older boys were sent to her sister's house. And then there was me. My uncle fought for custody of me, as my father's instability was no secret. With her children accounted for, she was ready to face the end. It didn't take long. Within a few months, she entered a care facility where she was placed on medication to ease her pain. By that time, I was settling into my new home. My life had transformed. I now had more toys than I'd ever seen, warm meals every day, and a routine. I was dressed every morning, a small thing, but one I wasn't used to. I was cared for in ways I hadn't experienced before. Then, one day, something unusual happened. According to my aunt, who was watching me play, I was sitting on the living room floor, happily pulling toys from a chest and playing with each in turn. Across the room was one of those classic toy rotary phones on wheels, the kind with a smiling face painted on it, a red receiver, and a string for pulling it around. Harmless, right? That's when it started ringing. My aunt swears to this day that it did. She was sitting on the couch, distracted by the TV, when the toy phone emitted a sound. Not the mechanical ching of its dial, but a distinct ringing, as if it were a real phone. At first, she thought she was imagining things. Then, I stood up, walked over to it, and picked up the receiver. "Hi, Mommy," I said. My aunt froze. I continued. "Is it time?" "Okay, I know, I will. I'll be a good boy and listen to Aunt and Uncle." "I love you, Mommy." I set the phone down, turned to my aunt, and said, "Your turn." Then, just like that, I went back to playing as if nothing had happened. Before she could process what she'd just seen, the actual house phone began to ring. My aunt answered, and on the other end was a nurse from the care facility. My mother had passed away just 5 minutes earlier. The story has always stayed with me. Was my aunt mistaken? Could it have been the power of a child's intuition, piecing together the subtle signs of his mother's fading presence, or did something extraordinary happen? A final connection from a mother to her child, using whatever means she could to say goodbye. Children are more perceptive than we often give them credit for, capable of noticing the things adults might try to hide. It's possible that I sensed her decline, her absence, the unspoken heaviness in the air. But that moment, that toy phone ringing at the exact time of her passing, that part is harder to explain. What do you think? I was just 12 years old, walking home from school. It was less than 2 blocks, a distance that felt safe enough that my parents didn't think twice about letting me walk alone. But that day changed everything. I was new in town, still figuring out the neighborhood, still unsure of what faces and places belonged. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the sidewalk as I walked, my backpack bouncing with each step. That's when I noticed it. A car slowing down just behind me. My gut tightened, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe they were just lost. Maybe they were looking for someone, right? But then the car stopped. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man. Something about him felt wrong. He wasn't walking towards a house or rummaging in the car like someone who'd pulled over for a normal reason. No, he was coming directly at me, and that's when I saw it. He wasn't wearing pants. I froze, my heart slammed against my chest. For a second, I didn't know what to do. My body screamed run, but my legs felt like they were sinking into the pavement. Then, as he got closer, his steps slow and deliberate, something clicked. My survival instincts kicked in, and I bolted. I didn't know where I was running. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was that I wasn't going to let him catch me. There was a house just ahead of me, the one he'd parked in front of. It had a glass door, and I prayed someone was home. I didn't even think twice. I yanked the door open and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Hi, Mom!" "Hi, Dad, I'm home." The words felt foreign, forced, but they tumbled out before I could stop them. I was trying to make it sound like I belonged there, like this was my home, like someone inside was waiting for me. I didn't know if it was his house, or a stranger's house, or what. I didn't care. All I knew was I couldn't let him see where I really lived. I didn't stop to see if anyone was inside. I darted through the house, my feet pounding against the floors. I weaved through rooms I didn't recognize, heart pounding in my ears. Somehow, I found the back door and burst through it, throwing myself into the yard. The shrubs clawed at my legs as I hurtled over them, not stopping to think, not stopping to breathe. My chest burned as I hit another street, my legs shaky but still moving. I didn't hear him behind me anymore, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I was too afraid that the moment I turned my head would be the moment he grabbed me. Finally, I made it home. My real home. I stumbled through the door, slammed it shut, and locked it. Every lock, every chain. Then I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. I was shaking. I felt like throwing up, but most of all, I felt lucky to have escaped, lucky to be safe. But that day stayed with me. Even now, all these years later, I can still see his face, still feel the panic in my chest. It's a reminder that even in the places we think we're safest, danger can be just around the corner. This story has lived in the deepest corners of my mind for decades. I've locked it away because facing the what if is almost too much to bear. But today, I'm going to open that box and share it with you. It was 1993. My mother had slipped and fractured her hip, so she was in the hospital for an extended period. Every evening, I visited her until closing time, offering her comfort and company. It was my routine: hospital visits, then walking to the car park and heading home. Quiet nights in a dimly lit parking lot. A place that should have been safe. Should have been. During these visits, I got to know a younger man. He always seemed to be around, hanging out in the same waiting areas, chatting with me as we passed each other in hallways or at the lifts. He seemed polite, friendly. I assumed he was also visiting someone, maybe a family member. We even shared snacks a few times, making small talk. It felt harmless. Then one night, as I left my mother's room and headed to the lifts, I saw him again. This time, he held out an unopened can of pop. "Here," he said, sipping from his own. I hesitated for a moment, but we'd shared snacks before, so I took it. I cracked the can open and took a sip before we stepped into the lift together. By the time we reached the car park, I had already drunk a third of it. That's when it hit me. My entire body began to shut down. I couldn't swallow. I couldn't blink. My legs felt like they'd been filled with lead, and my chest burned as I struggled to breathe. I was so scared, but I couldn't speak. My body just stopped. I felt myself sinking to the ground, my back resting against his leg for support. He crouched down, his voice soft, telling me to wait there. He said he'd pull his car around to the emergency doors and take me for help. I nodded weakly, not because I trusted him, but because I couldn't do anything else. My body wouldn't let me fight back. He returned quickly and helped me into the front passenger seat of his car, a white, long station wagon. He reclined the seat so I could lie back. I tried to focus, to figure out where we were going, but my mind was spinning. Every time I opened my eyes, I saw lights from the hospital buildings flying past, but we never stopped. Something wasn't right. I drifted in and out of consciousness. At one point, I was jolted awake by the sensation of the car rocking back and forth. My stomach churned, and I knew I was about to be sick. I turned my head to the side, and cold air hit my face. It calmed me just enough to hold off the nausea, but the rocking didn't stop. I couldn't form words, couldn't ask what was happening. The next thing I knew, I was throwing up. The car screeched to a stop. Suddenly, I felt hands dragging me out onto the ground. My stomach heaved, my face pressed against cold asphalt. I remember the smell of soil, grass, and dead leaves. It was so dark, I couldn't see anything. Then he grabbed me, jerking me to my feet, and hauled me to the back of the car. The boot opened, and I climbed inside, too weak to resist. I lay there, trying to make sense of what was happening, but my thoughts were jumbled, my body refusing to cooperate. The car started moving again. It bumped and rocked along what felt like a dirt path. I could taste the sickly sweetness of the pop lingering in my throat, and it made me gag. Time passed in a blur, but eventually I woke up. I crawled toward the back seat, trying to see where we were. Outside, everything was pitch black, except for faint rows of lights in the distance. I was terrified. I didn't know where I was or where he was taking me. The car swung down a narrow lane and came to a halt. The engine shut off. The driver's door opened and slammed shut, but I couldn't move. I lay there, frozen, listening to the sounds of footsteps crunching on gravel. Then I heard the unmistakable metallic ping of a baseball bat being dragged out of the car. What happened next was chaos. He started slamming the bat against the car. The entire vehicle shuddered with every hit. Over and over, the deafening thuds echoed in the night. My ears were ringing, my head spinning. I didn't know if he was trying to scare me, or if this was some kind of sick game. At one point, the music in the car blasted at full volume, only to stop abruptly as he resumed his frenzied attack on the vehicle. And then, silence. I don't know how, but I found the strength to move. I slithered out of the front seat, sliding under the car. My face pressed into the dirt as I tried to stay hidden. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for him to leave. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, I heard the car start up and drive away. When I finally felt safe enough to move, I crawled out from under the car and stumbled into the darkness. My legs were weak, my body bruised and battered, but I kept moving. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. At dawn, I saw houses in the distance. I hid in the bushes, terrified that anyone I approached might somehow hand me back to him. Eventually, I worked up the courage to approach a woman who let me use her phone to call my sister. She didn't ask questions, just let me sit and wait until help arrived. When my sister picked me up, she begged me to go to the police, but I was too exhausted, too traumatized. I made excuses and she eventually gave up. I never told anyone the full story until now. What haunts me most is the what if. What if I hadn't managed to hide? What if I hadn't escaped? Even all these years later, that fear lingers, and sometimes, in the quiet moments, it creeps back in. This happened in 1993. It's taken me this long to finally speak about it. But I'm still here, and I'll never stop fighting to stay here. This memory has lived in the back of my mind for decades, but I didn't realize its full weight until years later. When I finally did, the truth was enough to make me feel physically ill. Let me take you back to the early 1980s. I was no older than 5 or 6, just a young kid excited about the world and all it had to offer. Life back then was so different. Doors were left unlocked, and strangers weren't automatically seen as threats. People trusted each other in ways we wouldn't dream of today. Babysitters were often kids themselves, hired by families who barely knew them. It was a world that felt safer, at least on the surface. A family member of mine worked at the BBC during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It was a fascinating time to be connected to one of the most iconic broadcasting companies in the world. One summer, we went to visit him, and he managed to score us tickets to a taping of the Roland Rat Show. I was thrilled, wide-eyed and full of excitement. It felt like a dream come true. Portland Road Studios was buzzing with energy that day. Kids and their families filled the seats, laughter echoed down the hallways, and everything felt magical to me. Just before the show began, I needed to use the bathroom. Like any parent back then, my mom wasn't worried about me wandering off. She simply said, "You know where they are. I'll see you in a minute." I confidently headed toward the foyer and the corridor leading to the bathrooms. That's when I saw him. A man I recognized instantly from TV, a household name. He was charismatic, well-loved, the kind of person people trusted implicitly. He was like a friendly uncle to the entire nation. And there he was, standing in the corridor, surrounded by a group of children. I was thrilled. I mean, imagine seeing someone you know from television, someone larger than life, standing right in front of you. In my innocence, I ran toward him, full of excitement. He was talking to the children, telling them that he was going to take them backstage to show them where his TV show was filmed. I was desperate to be a part of it. I shouted out enthusiastically, "Can I come?" He looked at me, smiled, and said, "Ah, not this time, young man. This is just for the older children." And just like that, I was dismissed. My heart sank. I felt rejected, my little world shaken. I walked back to my seat with my head down, feeling embarrassed and unworthy. At the time, I couldn't have known how lucky I was. Decades later, in the late 2000s, the truth about him began to emerge. The charming, trusted face of family television turned out to be one of the most vile predators in history, Sir Jimmy Savile. When I learned about the horrifying things he did to children, including some who likely stood in that very group that day, I was overcome with a sickening realization. My stomach turned, and the gravity of the situation hit me like a freight train. I had stood face to face with a monster. The idea that I could have been one of those children who went backstage with him. The thought was unbearable. I was only spared because I was too young. Too young to fit the profile of the victims he preferred. It was sheer luck, a twist of fate that kept me safe. For over 2 decades, I had no idea how close I had come to being part of something unimaginable. I had brushed against evil itself, and only now could I comprehend how narrowly I had escaped. It's a memory that still makes my skin crawl. The feeling of rejection I carried as a child now seems laughable compared to the alternative. What felt like a heartbreak then turned out to be the luckiest moment of my life. This wasn't just a near miss. It was a brush with something unspeakably dark. Looking back, I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for being spared, but also a deep sorrow for the countless victims who weren't as lucky. And as I share this story with you now, I can only hope it serves as a reminder of how important it is to question, to stay vigilant, and to protect the most innocent among us. Because in this case, the world I thought was safe and kind had a monster hiding in plain sight. When I was 16, I had an experience that has stayed with me my entire life. Even now, decades later, I can still feel the fear and helplessness of that moment. It was 1957, a time when the world felt so different from today. People didn't discuss certain topics openly, and attitudes around behavior, especially what was seen as just boys being boys, were disturbingly casual. What happened to me that day was anything but casual, and it left a mark on me that I'll never forget. I remember it so clearly. It was late in the afternoon and I was walking home alone. The streets were quiet, and as I turned into a narrow alley that cut through to my neighborhood, I noticed 4 boys standing there. I recognized them from school. At first, I didn't think much of it. I even gave them a small smile, assuming they were just hanging out or up to some usual teenage mischief. But as I tried to pass, things took a frightening turn. They surrounded me, blocking my way, and before I could say a word, they grabbed me and pulled me deeper into the alley. My heart raced as I realized this wasn't just a prank or joke. It was something much more serious. I tried to yell, but one of them covered my mouth, and I was too afraid to fight back. Their laughter chilled me to my core, and though I didn't know exactly what they were planning, I knew it wasn't good. I felt trapped, completely helpless. These weren't strangers. I saw them every day at school, and that made it even more confusing. My mind raced with fear, and I thought they were going to hurt me and leave me there with no one to help. My body trembled, and I remember tears streaming down my face as I silently begged for someone, anyone, to come to my rescue. And then, as if my prayers were answered, a German shepherd dog came out of nowhere. It barked furiously, growling and baring its teeth. The boys froze, startled by the sudden appearance of this dog. For a moment, time stood still, and then the dog lunged at them. They screamed and scattered, running in every direction. The dog had saved me. I still don't know where it came from or why it appeared, but it was my guardian angel that day. The boys were eventually caught and held accountable, but what shocked me most was their reaction. They acted like it was no big deal, like it was just a joke that got out of hand. Even their solicitor called it a silly prank. A prank? How could anyone think cornering someone, scaring them, and making them feel so powerless was funny? It wasn't a joke to me. It was terrifying. Back then, in 1957, attitudes were different. People brushed off serious situations like this, especially when it involved teenage boys. But for me, it was a life-changing experience. The fear, the sense of helplessness, it's something I carried with me for years. Even now, I reflect on that moment and feel a mix of gratitude and lingering unease. To this day, I think about that dog. It felt like it was sent from above, there to protect me when I needed it most. I never saw it again, but its bravery gave me back my life that day. While the memory of what happened in that alley is something I'll never forget, neither is the incredible courage of that dog. It reminds me that even in the darkest moments, there's hope, and sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. For 14 years, like clockwork, every 21 days at exactly 9:37 p.m., I was struck by a blinding headache. It didn't matter where I was or what I was doing. It always happened. The pain was so intense that I would pass out, only to wake up the next morning with a pounding head, a nosebleed staining my pillow, and a small triangular cut somewhere on my skin. The first time this happened, it followed an event that I can only describe as utterly unexplainable. A day I've never been able to make sense of. It had already been a rough day at work, and I needed to clear my mind. Driving along some remote back roads always helped me relax, so I set off, hoping to leave the stress behind. As I cruised down the quiet, dark stretches of road, a strange hum caught my attention. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. A low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. At first, I thought it must be the sound of an irrigation pivot in one of the fields nearby, so I didn't think much of it. But the sound stuck with me, following me like a shadow. A few minutes later, I spotted something unusual in the distance. 7 amber-colored lights, glowing softly in the night sky. They were arranged in a boomerang shape, but with sharper angles, more like a stretched-out triangle than a true curve. I slowed down, my curiosity piqued, as I watched the lights descend behind a hill a little farther up the road. My first thought was that it could be a small plane crash, or maybe a drone malfunction, though it seemed odd that I hadn't heard an impact. Still, my conscience wouldn't let me ignore it. If there was even the slightest chance that someone was hurt, I had to check it out. I pulled my truck over as I reached the hill and climbed out, scanning the horizon for any sign of what I'd seen. As I crested the hill, my stomach dropped. Those lights weren't on the ground. They were hovering, maybe 20 or 30 feet above the road, completely still. My truck sputtered, then died. No warning lights, no sputtering, just silence. Already on edge from the day's frustrations, this was the last straw. I stormed to the front of the truck and popped the hood, hoping it was something simple, but I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. My temper flared. I grabbed a rock from the side of the road and hurled it at the lights, letting out a shout of pure frustration. To my surprise and slight satisfaction, I heard the rock hit something. The sound wasn't metallic, but it wasn't natural either, like it struck something smooth and hard. Then, the air changed. A gust of wind hit me, strong and strange. It wasn't cold, but it burned against my skin like a dry heat from an oven. My ears were filled with an odd, static-like noise, and before I could make sense of what was happening, everything went black. When I came to, I was no longer by the hill. Instead, I was driving down a dirt road near the interstate on the other side of town, my truck somehow running perfectly. My heart was racing as I checked the speedometer. I was doing 90 on a road I'd never willingly drive that fast on. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, trying to steady myself. I pulled over and tried to piece everything together, but nothing made sense. By my rough estimate, I couldn't have been out for more than 30 minutes after seeing the lights. But when I finally made it home and checked the clock, 4.5 hours had passed. No matter how I tried to account for it, there was simply no way I'd lost that much time. I decided to sleep it off, telling myself I'd feel better in the morning. But 21 days later, at 9:37 p.m. sharp, it began. A blinding headache unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. I barely made it to my bed before the pain overtook me, and I passed out. The next morning, I woke up to find my pillow streaked with blood from a nosebleed and a small, triangular mark on my forearm, like a clean incision that had already started to heal. At first, I brushed it off as a coincidence. Maybe I'd hit my head and not realized it. But when it happened again exactly 21 days later, and then again after that, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went to the doctor, hoping for answers. They ran every test imaginable, scans, blood work, you name it. But nothing was wrong. Neurologically, physiologically, I was perfectly healthy. Yet, the episodes continued, without fail, every 21 days. For years, I endured the cycle of headaches, nosebleeds, and unexplained cuts. And though I've tried to convince myself otherwise, I can't shake the feeling that it all started with those lights. I've never told anyone about them, not even my spouse. They've seen the aftermath, the bloody pillows, the grogginess, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them about that night. How could I? It sounds insane, even to me. Still, deep down, I'm convinced those lights had something to do with it. Whatever they were, whatever happened that night set something in motion. It stopped after 14 years, just as suddenly as it began. But if I ever see those lights again, I swear, I'll turn around and drive the other way as fast as I can. It's terrifying to think about, to experience something so profoundly strange, to have your life disrupted in such a mysterious way, and to have no answers. Maybe it's better that I'll never know. Maybe some questions are best left unanswered. It was a quiet Sunday morning in 1961, deep in the hills of eastern Kentucky. I was 19 years old, just starting to figure out life. That day, I was driving along a winding mountain road to visit my girlfriend at her family's home in the countryside. A light rain was falling, making the road slick, but I didn't think much of it. The road twisted and turned as it hugged the side of the mountain, and I'd driven it plenty of times before without a problem. But that day turned out to be very different. As I headed down a steep stretch, my tires lost grip on the wet pavement. The car slid into a ditch on one side of the road, then shot across to the other side, straight over a cliff. Time seemed to slow down as the car rolled down the hillside, turning over and over before finally crashing into the creek bed below, more than 100 feet down. When the car came to a stop, it was right side up, but completely wrecked. For a moment, I just sat there, dazed. Then, feeling the rush of adrenaline, I managed to climb out of the car. At first, I thought I was mostly okay, except for cuts on my arms from broken glass. But I soon realized I was in a tough spot. I was miles from town, in an area where hardly anyone passed by, especially on a Sunday morning when most folks were at church. Back then, there were no cell phones, no 911, and no easy way to call for help. I knew I had to climb back up to the road if I wanted anyone to find me. I grabbed a small tree to pull myself up, but as I leaned forward, something warm started running down my face. I reached up and touched my head, and that's when I realized how bad it was. I had a deep cut across the top of my head, from ear to ear, and my scalp was hanging down the back of my neck. I pushed it back into place and held it there. Even though I felt dizzy and weak, I tried climbing again. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. About 75 yards up the hill, off to the right, was an old house with a small dirt path leading to it. It was hidden from view on the main road, which is probably why I'd never noticed it before, even though I'd driven this road many times. On the porch sat a man, casually watching me. He looked to be in his 30s, thin, wearing slacks, a button-up shirt, and a hat. He stood up, walked over to an old car parked near the house, and drove out to the main road, stopping right above me. Rolling down his window, he called out, "If you can get up here, I'll take you to town and get you to a hospital." He didn't get out of his car. He didn't come down to help. He just waited. Even though I was in bad shape, seeing him gave me the push I needed. I grabbed tree after tree, clawing my way up the cliff until I finally reached the road. I collapsed into the passenger seat of his car, completely drained. The man handed me a light jacket that had been lying between us on the seat. "You're losing a lot of blood," he said calmly. "Press this against your head, hard." I did as he said while he drove. He didn't talk much during the drive. keeping his eyes on the road and his hands steady on the wheel. After about 25 minutes, we reached the outskirts of Paintsville, Kentucky. He asked me, "Which hospital do you want to go to?" I told him the name of the downtown clinic where my mom had worked, and he drove me straight there. When we arrived, he stopped the car, but didn't get out. "Do you think you can make it inside on your own?" he asked. I nodded, thanked him, and stumbled into the hospital. Doctors rushed to help me. They stitched up my head, 55 stitches, and gave me the care I needed. After a few days, I was on the mend. When I got home, my dad and I decided to go back to thank the man properly. We also wanted to offer to clean his car and replace the jacket I had ruined. But when we returned to the spot where the house had been, everything felt off. The small dirt road leading to the house was now overgrown with tall weeds, and it looked like no car had driven there in a long time. It was hard to believe this was the same place I had seen just a few days earlier. We walked through the weeds to the house itself. It was old and abandoned, with broken windows and no furniture inside. It was clear no one had lived there for years. Confused, I asked my girlfriend's family if they knew anything about the house or the man. They didn't. Everyone said the house had been empty for as long as they could remember, and no one knew anyone who fit the man's description. To this day, I can't explain what happened. How did the man know to be there at that exact moment? Why didn't he get out of his car to help? And how did he know the area so well, even though the house was hidden? It's as if he appeared just to save me. Some people have told me he might have been sent by a higher power, like an angel in disguise. Others think it was just an incredible stroke of luck. I don't know the answer, but I'll always be thankful to him, whoever or whatever he was. All I know is, without his help, I might not have made it that day. It was a quiet evening, somewhere between 11 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., when I decided to make a quick stop at a nearby store to grab a soda and maybe a snack. The parking lot was empty when I pulled in, not a single other car in sight. I parked my Jeep, went inside, and wandered the aisles for a few minutes. As I was looking for something to munch on, I noticed a car pull up outside. It parked on one end of the lot, headlights still on, engine running. I remember thinking it was a little odd that the person inside didn't come in right away, but I shrugged it off, figuring it wasn't my business. After paying for my things, I walked back to my Jeep. As I was about to leave, a strange thought crossed my mind. Wouldn't it be weird if they pulled out right after I did? I started my Jeep, backed out, and headed toward the exit. Sure enough, the car backed out almost immediately and began following me. I didn't live far from the store, barely half a mile down the road, but something about this car made me uneasy. Instead of driving straight home, I decided to test whether they were actually following me. I turned into a self-service car wash that was just a block away. They followed me in. I pulled into one of the front bays, pretending like I was there to wash my car. They stayed in one of the back bays, their car idling. The uneasy feeling in my stomach grew stronger. I decided I wasn't sticking around. I pulled out of the car wash, intentionally turning in the opposite direction of my house. Sure enough, they followed me again. They weren't right on my bumper, but they were close enough that it felt intentional. I drove in circles for a while, hoping they'd get bored or give up. Eventually, I managed to lose them by running through a light just as it was turning red. Thankfully, they didn't follow me through. With my heart pounding, I headed home, relieved to have shaken them off. About a week later, I found myself back at the same store around the same time of night. To my surprise and growing discomfort, I saw the same car parked in the lot. My heart sank. Not again. This time, I decided to confront the situation. As I walked toward their car to see what their problem was, they suddenly drove off. But they didn't go far. I saw them pull into a spot just down the street. Feeling uneasy, I walked back to my Jeep, telling myself to stay calm. The thought crossed my mind. What if they're dangerous? I didn't want to take any chances, so I drove off, carefully watching to see if they'd follow me again. Sure enough, they did. For the second time, I managed to lose them after some careful maneuvering. But the encounter left me on edge. Who were these people? And why were they so interested in me? A couple of weeks passed, and I thought maybe it was over. But one night I noticed the same car parked across the street from the store at a closed service station. They didn't approach or follow me this time, but their presence was enough to make me uneasy. I decided right then that I wouldn't lead them to my house where my family lived. Another week went by, and I spotted the car again. This time, they appeared out of nowhere, following me, even though I hadn't been to the store. I wasn't sure how long they'd been behind me, but I decided I wasn't going to make it easy for them. When I had a chance, I passed another car and quickly got into the lane in front of them, forcing the follower to stay behind the car I'd just passed. Then, I slowed down enough to prevent them from getting around. The road was approaching a traffic light. My lane was a right turn lane, and theirs was a straight-through lane. Because of how close we were to the light, they didn't have time to switch lanes. They went straight, and I turned right, quickly doubling back through a few side streets to make sure they were really gone before heading home. For a while, I didn't see them again. Then, one evening, I saw the car once more. This time, I managed to maneuver behind them and get a look at their license plate. I memorized the number, but oddly enough, after that night I never saw the car again. To this day, I don't know what their intentions were or why they seemed so focused on following me. Looking back, it's easy to wonder if they were just messing around or if they had more serious intentions. At the time, I didn't have a cell phone, which made the whole situation even more unnerving. My sister had once suggested to my parents that I should have one for emergencies, but none of us thought it was necessary. I certainly didn't until this happened. This whole experience left me feeling unsettled for a long time. Even now, it's a memory that sends shivers down my spine. Whatever their reason, I'm just thankful it didn't escalate further. But it was definitely one of the creepiest experiences of my life. It was the summer of 1977, a time when life felt a bit simpler, though it had certainly become busier for me. I had recently taken a break from my regular job to stay home and care for my newborn daughter. Even with the time off, I still needed to contribute financially, so my mom offered me and my younger sister a job at her antique shop. Mom had just received a shipment of European oak furniture, and our task was to clean, polish, and assemble the pieces. It was hard, messy work, but I didn't mind. It allowed me to spend time with my sister and still make it home to care for my baby. One warm afternoon, as we were polishing a particularly large armoire, a young man entered the shop. He was well-dressed, pleasant-looking, and seemed very confident. He introduced himself as Ted Smith. We exchanged some friendly small talk, and I even joked about how we might be distant relatives since Smith was my mom's maiden name. He laughed along and seemed charming at first, though my sister and I quickly noticed his attention was focused almost entirely on her. My sister was 17 at the time, and though she was polite, I could tell she wasn't especially interested in his attempts to engage her. After browsing the store for a while, Ted decided he wanted to buy the large armoire we'd been working on. However, he mentioned he'd need to go fetch his truck to transport it since he was currently driving an old VW Bug. Before leaving, he turned the conversation toward us, asking if we'd like to go out to dinner with him that night. I felt a bit surprised at how forward he was. We were sweaty and dirty from a long day of work. I had a baby to take care of, and my sister already had a boyfriend. We politely declined, but he didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he turned to me and asked if I could ride with him to pick up his truck while he dropped his VW off for repairs. I declined again. I needed to get home to my baby, who was due for her feeding. His persistence only grew from there. He started asking if we could stay late so he could pick up the armoire after hours. We told him that we closed at 6 p.m. and didn't stay late, no exceptions. Then he asked if one of us could meet him early in the morning, around 5:30 a.m. We said no to that as well. By this point, my sister and I were exchanging nervous glances. Ted was becoming more than just a persistent customer. He was starting to feel unsettling. He had been in the shop for nearly 2 hours, chatting and trying to convince us to meet him on his terms. When he finally left, claiming he couldn't buy the armoire if we weren't flexible, we felt relieved to see him go. At 6 p.m., as we locked up the shop, we saw his VW Bug still parked outside. Ted rolled down his window and asked if we'd reconsider joining him for coffee. This time, his attention was almost exclusively on my sister. Despite his charm, she wasn't interested, and his continued insistence was beginning to feel threatening. We both politely declined once again, firmly explaining that we had plans for the evening. When he finally drove away, I felt a lingering sense of unease. My sister had her car at the shop, but I decided to drive her home myself, unwilling to let her leave alone after such an encounter. At the time, neither of us realized the significance of what had just happened. We chalked it up to a strange and overly persistent man, though we agreed his behavior had been unsettling. It wasn't until the following year that everything clicked into place. A photo of the man who had introduced himself as Ted Smith appeared in the newspapers, and his real name, Ted Bundy, was splashed across the headlines. My sister and I were horrified to recognize him as the same man who had lingered in the shop that day, trying so hard to get us to leave with him. The revelation hit us like a ton of bricks. Bundy was a name that sent shivers down everyone's spine, and we had unknowingly been targeted by him. For weeks after seeing his photo in the paper, I replayed that day in my mind. What if we had agreed to meet him later that evening or early the next morning? What if one of us had gone with him to pick up his truck? The realization that we had narrowly avoided becoming part of his horrific story was deeply unsettling. My sister and I talked about it often, grappling with the idea that our polite refusals and mutual support had likely saved our lives. Even now, decades later, the memory haunts us. Ted Bundy went on to become infamous for his heinous actions, claiming the lives of many young women. Knowing how close we came to being part of that history is chilling. It's a reminder of how important it is to trust your instincts, stay cautious, and support each other in uncertain situations. To this day, I feel immense gratitude that we made the choices we did that afternoon. Our lives could have been tragically different if we hadn't. When I was about 8 years old, I lived in Alaska with my parents, my little brother, and our 2 dogs. It was a close-knit neighborhood where all the kids knew each other and would often play together. Among the neighborhood kids were a pair of twins, a couple of years older than me. Though I can't recall their names now, I vividly remember how they loved to tease me. They'd make fun of me for being younger, still having training wheels on my bike, and for liking shows like My Little Pony. Their teasing always got under my skin, and one day I decided to confront them. Determined to stand up for myself, I hopped on my bike and headed across the street toward their house. It was a warm day, and I was wearing just a tank top, some shorts, and my favorite Hello Kitty hat. Feeling a mix of bravery and frustration, I pedaled to the edge of the street, ready to tell them off. But before crossing, I stopped to do what my parents had taught me: look both ways. I glanced left and right. There was no sign of any cars, and the street was silent. Confident it was safe, I started pedaling across. The road had 2 lanes, one for traffic going each way. As I reached the middle of the street, I suddenly became aware of movement. 2 large vans, one white and one black, appeared seemingly out of nowhere. They were on opposite lanes but driving side by side, heading in the same direction. They were moving so fast that I could hardly process it. To make it even stranger, there was no sound. No engines roaring, no tires screeching, just the surreal sight of these 2 vans speeding toward me. Before I could react, the white van was directly in front of me. My bike was in the middle of the street, and I was sure there was no way I wouldn't be hit. My front wheels stretched far enough that at least one of the vans should have collided with them, sending me tumbling. Yet, inexplicably, nothing happened. One moment, the vans were right there, and the next, they had sped past me, continuing down the road as if I wasn't even there. I sat, frozen on my bike, completely dazed. The realization of what had just happened should have sent me into a panic. I was a sensitive and emotional child, quick to cry when upset or overwhelmed. But in that moment, I felt none of the fear or anxiety I expected. I wasn't crying, shaking, or even worried. It was as if my mind had been wrapped in a strange calmness, and the near miss didn't bother me at all. The more I think about that day, the more it puzzles me. The entire event felt unreal, almost like something out of a dream. How did those vans miss me when they should have hit my bike? Why were they moving so fast and soundlessly? And why was I so calm about something that could have ended so differently? At the time, I didn't think too much about it. I just shrugged it off, went back home, and carried on with my day. Now, looking back as an adult, I still don't have answers. The event stands out in my memory as something I can't fully explain. Whether it was an unexplainable stroke of luck, some kind of protective intervention, or just a bizarre glitch in reality, I'll never know. All I know is that I was sitting in the middle of the street, ready for something terrible to happen. And yet, I pedaled away unharmed, as though nothing had been there at all. It's a moment that remains as mysterious to me now as it was back then.